Welcome to Midnight Mysteries. If you feel like listening to a horror story, you're in the right place. Please press the subscribe button to be part of this community. I've always been different, an outcast in every sense. From the moment I entered this world, I was discarded, abandoned by the very people who should have cherished me. My birth parents couldn't bear the sight of me. They gave me away the same day I was born. I came into the world with a face that was more nightmare than human, with parts of my upper lip and most of my nose missing. In their place was a small, vertical gap, a reminder of what I lacked. My eyes were spaced far apart, unnaturally so, giving me a look that was more alien than human. Had I been born a century ago, I doubt I would have survived. Perhaps I would have been quietly smothered in some dimly lit room, or left to die in a forgotten corner. If I were fortunate, someone might have sold me to a freak show, where people like me were displayed for the morbid curiosity of the public. But here I am, in a world that doesn't quite know what to do with someone like me. My parents didn't want me, and so I ended up at an orphanage on the very day I was born. A place that became the only home I've ever known. I was raised in Massachusetts, within the foster care system. A place that sounds more dignified than it really is. The system is a repository for children like me. Those who are too different, too broken to be adopted. At any given time, there were about a dozen of us living in the facility. Some had deformities, though none as severe as mine. Others were blind or deaf, or suffered from some mental or physical disability that marked them as different. A few bore the scars of burns or other traumas, wounds that never truly heal, no matter how much time passes. Our home was a decrepit building called the Samuelson Center, a place with a history as grim as its appearance. It was once the state's original mental asylum, back when such places were little more than warehouses for the unwanted. A larger, more modern facility was built nearby to replace it, and that's where Massachusetts now houses its most disturbed and dangerous individuals. The new asylum loomed just 100 yards away from us, a constant reminder of what lay beyond our small world. On certain days, when the light hit just right, we could see the faces of the inmates through the bars of their windows. It was unsettling, to say the least, knowing that so many unstable minds were so close. The Samuelson Center itself was a dark and drafty place, a building that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Cracks ran like veins across the walls and ceilings, a testament to the years of neglect. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. The heating system worked most of the time, but in winter, icy drafts would sneak through the gaps in the windows, sometimes forming frost on the inside panes. In the spring, leaks would spring up in the roof, and water would drip down into the halls for days before anyone got around to fixing it. The sound of water dripping was a constant, a reminder of the building's slow decay. But there was something else, something far more unsettling than the constant state of disrepair. There were whispers about a ghost that haunted the Samuelson Center, a story passed down from one generation of children to the next. It was said to roam the halls at night, a shadowy figure that few had ever seen but everyone had heard about. The nearby asylum, too, was rumored to be haunted, its dark past filled with unspeakable horrors. The idea of a ghost was both terrifying and oddly comforting. At least it was something beyond the mundane horror of our everyday lives. At night, I often felt something cold brush against my face, But when I opened my eyes, there was nothing there. Sometimes, I'd wake up feeling paralyzed, unable to move, with only vague, shadowy memories of my dreams. The sensation of being watched, of something hovering just out of sight, became a constant companion in the dark hours. Legally, we were wards of the state, but in reality, we had as few rights as the inmates across the way. The doors to our building were always locked, and we could only go outside if escorted by staff. We even had what you might call guards, people whose job it was to make sure none of us ran away. The section where we lived was called the foster unit, or FOO for short. The kids there were known as FOOs, a name that carried more than one meaning. We used the term with a mix of resignation and dark humor, a way of acknowledging the truth of our situation. And maybe we were all messed up in our own ways. The staff didn't care much about us beyond keeping us fed and clothed. Any affection or kindness was an anomaly, a rare thing that we learned not to expect. The only advantage of being in the system was that the government paid for all of my surgeries. There were many, starting when I was just a baby and continuing throughout my childhood. They called me No Face because, before the surgeries, my face was so disfigured that it hardly looked like a face at all. The nickname was cruel, but it fit, and eventually, I stopped caring about what they called me. The doctors at the children's hospital did their best, managing to construct a nose for me. It wasn't perfect, crooked and off-center, but at least it was there. They tried to fix my eyes too, twice, but both attempts failed. So, I was still far from normal, still far from human in the eyes of others. My earliest memories are of pain, unbearable, searing pain. It felt like my skull was being split open from the inside. A relentless pressure that threatened to crack me apart. These weren't just headaches. They were something far worse. My vision would blur, and I'd see flashes of light so intense that it felt like my eyes were on fire. The pain was so excruciating that I often vomited, and only then would the migraines start to ease. These attacks were a constant presence in my life, sometimes coming several times a week, month after month, year after year. The pain became my companion, something I learned to endure because there was no other choice. As I grew older, the migraines changed. Instead of just pain, I began to see things. One thing in particular, a figure, a man made entirely of shadow. At first, I thought it was a hallucination, a trick my mind was playing on me in the midst of the pain. But soon, I realized it was real. I had heard the stories about the ghost that haunted our halls, and I began to believe that this shadow man was it. There was something about him that felt different from the usual nightmares that plagued me, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. He was always just out of focus, a vague, human-like shape, dark and shadowy. He lingered in the dimmest parts of the building, never stepping into the light. Despite my misaligned eyes, my vision was sharp, and I could see everything in the room clearly, except for him. It was as if he existed on the edge of reality, just beyond the reach of normal sight. I started calling him the Shadow Man. He moved slowly, as if he were gliding over the floor, never making a sound. His body seemed to flex and bend in unnatural ways, as though he had no bones, no structure. He was a figure of darkness, a living shadow that seemed to absorb the light around him. No one else seemed to notice him, but I never dared ask directly. The idea that I might be the only one who could see him was both terrifying and isolating. One day, I let it slip to a nurse that I had seen the Shadow Man. She looked at me with a mix of pity and concern, and without a word, she locked me in this safe room. It was a tiny closet used in the past to calm down agitated patients, a relic from the days when the building had housed the mentally ill. All I had was a small mattress and a bucket for a toilet. The room smelled of old fear, of the desperate breaths of those who had been locked in there before me. I wasn't going to use that bucket, so I screamed and banged on the door until she finally let me out. The hours I spent in that room felt like days, the darkness pressing in on me until I thought I might lose my mind. After that, I never mentioned the Shadow Man to anyone again. A new boy came to stay at the Foo not long after that. His name was William, though everyone called him Billy. He had been in the foster system too, but a fire left him with scars that landed him in the Samuelson Center. His face was almost healed, but his arms and legs were covered in thick, scaly scars that looked like alligator skin. The fire had taken more than just his flesh. It had burned away any chance he had of fitting in with the normal world. We weren't exactly friends, but being the same age, we talked a lot. In a place like this, you take what companionship you can get, even if it's with someone who is as broken as you are. One night, Billy told me he had seen a ghost. His description matched my Shadow Man perfectly. I was stunned. I had thought I was the only one who could see it. The idea that Billy had seen it too made the Shadow Man feel even more real, more threatening. Billy wanted me to share a secret in return, but I hesitated. I didn't want to risk being locked in that room again. Instead, I lied and told him that because of how I looked, I liked to imagine I was a monster and that I hurt the people who hurt me. The lie came easily, but it left a bitter taste in my mouth. Billy gave me a strange look, but then laughed it off. We were both damaged, both hiding our own fears behind humor and bravado. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the Shadow Man haunted me, and the knowledge that Billy had seen him too only made it worse. I snuck down the hall to the bathroom, needing some time alone to think. As I sat in one of the shower stalls, the cold tiles pressing against my back, I thought about what Billy had told me. The Shadow Man was real, and that meant there was something here, something malevolent and dangerous that we couldn't escape. The night janitor, Mr. Lawson, came in to clean, his keys jangling as he pushed his cart down the hall. He had just started his routine when the Shadow Man appeared behind him. I watched in horror as the Shadow Man reached out and Mr. Lawson froze, mid-sweep. Black smoke began to pour from Mr. Lawson's eyes and mouth, drifting toward the Shadow Man's outstretched hand. Mr. Lawson's face grew pale and gaunt as the life drained from him. His body shriveled, becoming a dried-up husk, a shadow of the man he had been moments before. I huddled in the corner, pressing myself against the cold tiles, praying the Shadow Man wouldn't notice me. Mr. Lawson's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed, dead. The sound of his body hitting the floor was the only thing that broke the silence. The Shadow Man moved to the entrance of the shower room, only a few feet away from me. It trembled violently, as if something inside it was struggling to escape. Then, it regurgitated a small, writhing creature, which attached itself to the Shadow Man's leg. The thing was barely recognizable as living, a mass of twitching tentacles and slimy flesh. It looked like it was spawning, reproducing in a way that made my stomach turn. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but I stayed silent, watching as the Shadow Man faded into nothingness. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours, too terrified to check on Mr. Lawson. The next day, We were told he had died of a heart attack, a sudden and unexpected tragedy. But I knew better. I had seen the truth. Still, I kept my mouth shut, knowing that no one would believe me. The memory of what I had seen was like a weight in my chest, something I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. At the orphanage, we had teachers, and yes, we received an education. But the one thing they never taught us about was religion. I often wondered if the shadow man was a ghost or a demon, maybe even an angel or the devil himself. The questions gnawed at me, but there was no one to ask. The teachers and staff avoided the subject of the supernatural, as if pretending it didn't exist would make it go away. But I couldn't forget what I had seen, what I had felt in the presence of the shadow man. We didn't get hugs or bedtime stories, and there were no parents to tuck us in at night. We were alone, left to fend for ourselves in a world that had no place for us. The staff did their jobs, but they didn't care about us beyond the basics. We were just another task, another responsibility to be managed. So we grew up fast, learning to rely on ourselves and each other, forming bonds that were as fragile as the lives we lived. Many children came and went over the years, moving through the doors of the Samuelson Center like ghosts. Most of them stayed only for a few months before being placed in foster homes or, if they were lucky, being adopted. I had been there for as long as I could remember, and I had seen more kids come and go than I could count. I never became close with most of them. It was easier that way. Friendships in a place like this were fleeting, and saying goodbye was always painful. A few kids were nice to me, but I knew better than to expect too much. Last night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and move, as if they were alive. The memory of Mr. Lawson's death was fresh in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow man was near. Suddenly, he appeared, fading into existence at the far side of the room. He was closer than ever before, his form more solid, more real. I froze, too terrified to move. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with a sense of dread. The shadow man floated by each bed, pausing briefly at each one as if inspecting the boys who slept there. He never stopped for long, but I could feel his presence growing stronger as he moved closer to me. When he finally reached my bed, he turned to face me, his dark form looming over me. I could feel his gaze, though I couldn't see his eyes. It was as if he were looking straight into my soul. He pointed at me, then at himself, and I knew he was asking if I could see him. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could barely breathe. But I knew I had to answer. Hesitantly, fearfully, I nodded. He glided closer, his legs never moving, his body hovering just inches above the floor. This time, he saw me. This time, I was no longer invisible to him. I was terrified, more scared than I had ever been in my life. He leaned in close, so close that I could feel the cold radiating off of him. His face was near mine, and for the first time, I could make out his true form. He wasn't human. He wasn't even close. Where his face should have been was a massive, lidless eye, surrounded by scales that glistened in the dim light. The eye was unblinking, a void that seemed to swallow everything in its gaze. His arms were long, twisted tentacles, covered in the same reptilian scales. They reached out and engulfed my head, wrapping around me like the coils of a snake. I wanted to close my eyes, to block out the sight of him, but I couldn't. The tentacles wriggled and slithered across my skull, each one searching for a place to latch onto. I screamed, but no sound came out. The terror was too much, too overwhelming. A cold energy surged from his tentacles into my body, paralyzing me completely. I felt my thoughts being pulled from my mind, memories surfacing only to be drained away, one by one. He was reading my mind, reliving my experiences as if they were his own. I could feel him focusing on Mr. Lawson's death, replaying the memory over and over, savoring the terror I had felt. It seemed to enjoy my fear, as if it were feeding off it, growing stronger with every passing moment. The examination of my mind went on for what felt like an eternity, though time itself seemed to have frozen. Nothing moved, not even the clock on the wall. The room was silent, still, as if the world had stopped. Eventually, he released me and stepped back, watching me as if waiting to see how I would react. Suddenly, I realized one of his tentacles rested on my shoulder, its fingers crawling up the side of my face like worms. He forced images into my mind, and though I fought to keep them out, it was useless. It was like trying to stop a waterfall with my bare hands. The images answered all the questions I had been too afraid to ask. These creatures, the shadow men, fed on us. They consumed our memories and dreams, especially our nightmares, which were the most delicious to them. They were energy, not matter, and they could walk through walls, disappear, and reappear at will. Light suffocated them like water drowns a human. That's why they thrived in the darkness. The migraines that had plagued me for years were caused by him, by this shadow man draining my thoughts and emotions. The realization made me sick, and I fought the urge to vomit as I understood the horror of what was happening to me. Before he left, I managed to ask him, silently, if they had a name for us. His answer came not in words, but in a series of revolting images that made my stomach churn. "We call you food." And just like that, he was gone, fading into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. But I knew the truth. I was nothing more than a meal to him, a source of sustenance. And now, I understood why I could never remember my dreams. They had eaten them all. Did you like it? Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the next stories. See you soon.